like everybody else, I started collecting comics when I was probably 5 years old. In fact, I learned to read from comics. But like everybody else, about when I got to be 12 or 13 years old, I discovered other things, such as girls and all those other peripheral activities we all know and love. But then my life drifted away from comics, as everybody else does, and you go to work and you do whatever you got to do. Then I got, when I was about 21 years old, I was down Wildwood, New Jersey, which is a vacation resort, and I was with my little nephew at the time, who was 9 years old. And he was reading a Batman comic. I'll never forget, it was a Batmite, a detective issue, which you can relate to, Gary. And I got this tremendous nostalgic flashback. I couldn't believe that, geez, I didn't realize how much I missed these things. This is like something I got to do when I go back. So I made this mental note. When I go back, look into old comics and see if I can find out if any still exist. Well, unbeknownst to me, when I got back, there was this, at the time, whole big world of collecting that I had no clue about. Not anywhere like it is today, but nonetheless, to me, an amazing thing. And so I was always the kind of guy to go direct. So I called Marvel Comics and I called DC Comics, and I asked the question that everybody's asked over the years: do you guys carry back issues? Do you have any old comics? Oh no, of course not. But they turned me on to Phil Souling. Phil, the late Phil Souling, was the founding father of the direct sale market. And Phil spent an hour and a half with me on the phone. Never talked to him before in my life. And he's telling me all about the conventions in New York and this and that and the other. And he mentioned the price guide. And I didn't know about it either. So first thing I did is I found out how to get a price guide. Well, I was enamored with the idea that these old comic books were worth money, because now my hobby and my desire to have things that I had when I was a child was now coupled with the mercenary side of me. As this is cool. Not only can I get the things I had when I was a kid, but I could make a few bucks. At the time, I was a letter carrier for the post office. And so in the morning when I'd be following mail up, I'd be looking at the, when I get all done, I'd be looking at publications such as the Antique Trader. And I'd look through and see what's going on. And suddenly I discovered, well before that, I started checking out the conventions, and I found it was this little world of collecting, and there was these certain guys there had all these old Golden Age comics that I never dreamed, still existed. And where did they get these things from? How do you find these? I've been asking people, nobody has any old comics. So I'm going back to my job, and in my mind, I'm knocking on doors. Do you have any old comics? And I start opening the Antique Trader. Somebody on my route had an Antique Trader. And I start seeing these ads. Wanted, old comics, Joe Gaga and Jim Archambault. I said, that's where these guys are getting these from. They're running these ads. So I started doing it myself. Next thing you know, I'm starting to wheel and deal, buy a few collections, and I'm accumulating an inventory. I was really going after it just primarily to get things I like, but at the same token, I was getting duplicates, and I was getting things I didn't like. So I started going to the conventions, and I started wheeling and dealing with the price guide, which I was totally enamored with. And next thing I know, I was making more money on the weekends than I was at my job. So this is cool. I like this. So about 1974, I had done a lot of conventions on the weekends. And I don't know where I got the nerve or stupidity or whatever you want to call it, but I decided, hey, I can do this full time. I can go to conventions every week or every other week. I can do mail order, and I'll make a fortune selling comics, more than my job. But I had no clue that the little store I was going to open was ever going to be anything, because I took it to be a place to store the comics, a place to work the comics, whatever. But as it turned out, it was new. Nobody had a comic store. I was like a unique thing in 1974 in the Baltimore area. I started to develop a little clientele. People were coming from all over the place. They were coming from Pennsylvania, West Virginia, this and that and the other. And the next thing you know, I had this little clientele built up. Well, Phil Souling had approached the publishers about the idea of selling new comics. And at the time, you have to understand that the whole business was built around back issues, buying them cheap and selling them high and wheeling and dealing. But you never dreamed new comics could have any practical value. In fact, when Phil said to you, you got to buy these new comic books for a whopping 40% off, and you got to pay me 2 months in advance, everybody said, sure, Phil, thanks, but no thanks. But something inside of me said, they might be a good loss leader draw. Maybe if I sell new comics, people will come from all over town to get their new comics, because I'll get them early and I'll be able to save them a couple bucks on a little discount. And then I'll get them in the store and I'll sell them back issues. Well, one thing led to another. I took the plunge. I sent my $400 up front 2 months in advance to Phil. And I got my first shipment 2 months later. I'd already sent the second $400. And before the first book come, I was ready to send the third $400. And yet at the time, you had to order books in increments of 25. So if you wanted 25 Superman, that was cool. But if you needed 27, you had to order 50. And if you wanted 5 House of Mysteries, you had to order 25. So it was a real problem. So I did it. And I started developing, and I instituted what a lot of customers today, my customers, retailers, call a pull and hold service or subscription service. I started doing that because I wanted to make sure the guy on the other side of town would buy his books from me. So I said, hey, fill out this little checklist, and buy, I'll get them for you and save them for you, give you 10% off. Over a period of time, I was starting to really develop a neat little clientele, and they were coming in, they were buying the new comics, and that was growing. But I was also developing a real good reputation for buying and selling the old Golden Age comics, as I would run my ads in the Antique Trader and Overstreet's Price Guide and the like. So that was about 1974 when I opened that first store, GEPPI's Comic World. So 1978, I'm still wheeling and dealing. I get this opportunity to buy a store in Silver Spring, Maryland, and I do it. Paid the guy $19,000 in cash, I'll never forget. Now, I am one person. For the first time in my life, I need an employee. I can't be in two places at once. So I hire this young fella who's, believe it or not, working for me to this day in the computer department at Diamond. But he went to work for me. We opened the second store. 1979, I opened a third store in Crystal City Underground Mall in Virginia. 1980, this brand new concept comes along in Baltimore called Harbor Place, which is a festival marketplace, really upscale mall. First comic store ever to go into a mall. I do it. So about that time, I got 4 stores, and I'm starting to become a pretty big customer for my distributor. And he's having some financial problems, but nonetheless, I'm a big customer, so I'm getting a bigger discount. So a lot of my friends who are now starting to get into the act to sell comics, I said, hey Steve, can you get me new comics wholesale? Sure, as a friend, I'll do it. Wasn't really something I was looking at as a business. I was doing it by default as a friend. Before I know it, I started having 3 or 4 of these guys, and I'm still doing it not as a loss leader, just to accommodate them. But then my distributor starts having some trouble financially, and one thing leads another. Next thing you know, I work out this deal to take over his distribution. And at the time, he had a warehouse in Florida, and he had one in Boston. And now, for the first time, I was a legitimate, real distributor, because I was doing this for business, not for friendship. And I did the deal with him, and I was probably the newest kid in the block. I was like the 17th smallest, the number 17 distributor, whatever. I was the lowest guy on the totem pole. And I went ahead and did the deal with him, but I saw that he had a nucleus of a really good administrative system. He had a couple people working there that I respected and admired for what they were doing, an order processing system, so I bought it. And I was really buying into that system. So we went on our merry way, and one thing led to another. And I separated the two businesses at that time. In February 1st, 1982, I separated GEPPI's Comic World, formerly a proprietorship, to GEPPI's Comic World, Inc., and Diamond Comic Distributors, Inc., which, interesting little anecdote about that is that the name Diamond came from the fact that I always believed that whatever you did, your name of your business should tell you exactly what you do. So I said, what is it we do? I said, at the time, the distinguishing mark between a returnable comic book and a non-returnable part of the comic book was these little black diamonds in the upper left-hand corner, so that they would know which ones to take back and give credit, which ones not to. Well, I said, that's it. We're the people that sell the Diamond comics. We're the Diamond comic distributors. A month later, Marvel changed it after I did my name, but we did that. Then time went on, and about 1983, there was a distributor in the South, in Waycross, Georgia, called S&L Sales, old Spencer Parrott. He's still around to this day, nice old gentleman. And he was got in our business, not because he wanted to be, because somebody aggravated him into our business, and he just wanted to teach him a lesson. So he started being a nuisance to all the distributors down in Florida. He would run trucks and guarantee 50% off, Friday morning delivery at 8 o'clock, everything to hassle us. But at some point he got tired of it, and I approached him and I said, Spencer, would you be interested in selling your account base? And that was the first, quote-unquote, acquisition, short of what happened with the distributor I was more like a demise. And I bought him out. Now suddenly I had 125 new accounts serviced all over the Southeast. And I realized quickly I wasn't going to be able to service them from the same locations. So all in the grand year of 1984, in March, I opened my Charlotte warehouse. In April, I opened my Atlanta/Cleveland, Tennessee warehouse, which I'm sure you'll appreciate. I had an employee who drove down, so we had a pseudo warehouse there. May, we opened Columbus, Ohio, and in December we opened in Sparta, Illinois, which is the center of the country as far as printing is concerned for comics. 5 warehouses in one summer. Opened it all up, and we found that it was clear to me at that point that regional distribution was the future. You had to be physically close to the accounts in order to service them, because speed of delivery was everything. They had to have the books before the ink was dry. Anyway, did that deal. One thing led to another. We've had a history of mergers and acquisitions, and over the years, we bought out numerous different distributors. As you know, I had this expand and contract theory with the Sparta location, which was in the center of the country. Sparta would grow, and it'd suddenly get a lot of accounts in the Chicago area. And we'd say, gee, there's a lot of accounts in Chicago. Let's open a Chicago warehouse, put them all in Chicago, shrink back down in Sparta. Sparta would grow. Gee, we got a lot of accounts in Dallas. Let's open a Dallas warehouse, shrink down. Sparta would grow. And we keep, et cetera and so forth. It wasn't until 1988, after I'd done a few other little mergers and acquisitions, that Bud Plant, who was the third largest distributor at the time, and I, who had been friends, talked, and Bud was kind of interested in getting back into his mail-order hands-on business. And we ended up working out a deal, and that was the biggest acquisition we made at the time, because we were doing, at that time, about $19 million a year, and Bud was doing about 11, so he was a 60% increase in our size overnight. And ironically, it turned out to be almost 100% increase because the business grew exponentially. So we did the deal with Bud, and for the first time, we were a nationwide distributor. We had warehouses all over the country. Since then, there's been the Destiny Second Genesis deal, most recently in London, the Titan Distributors deal. I'm giving you kind of the history of GEPPI Diamond, but all told, the one thing that's been the driving, motivating force for me, as you know, Gary, aside from my reputation for GEPPI's and more so Diamond, I love the old stuff, the Golden Age comics. And you asked me earlier on, and I went off on a tangent with this, about what it is that got me into this. And I remember when I was a kid, loving, the comics that were coming out, the Silver Age that you and I love. But there was a time when I was getting to be 12 or 13, the artists were changing, and they were coming out with some things I didn't like so much, and I was losing interest. And you know what got me out of comics? And if I'd have hung on for another year, I might have never broke the continuity, and maybe that's good that this happened, was availability. I couldn't buy old comics. There was no place to go find back issues in the late 50s, early 60s. I found out in retrospect that when I did quit, later on in life, I found out it was right around the time that Howard Rogowski started running ads, and had I hung on, I might have had a new source of supply and stayed with it. How old am I now? I'm 43. So in 1959, are we? So that's why we relate so much to this stuff. I was born in January of 50, so close. But the bottom line is, in 1959, interesting little story. There was a little place, I said there was no place to buy back issues, but there was one. And on Lombard and Central Avenue in Baltimore was a little liquor store, which is now a parking lot. And there was a little old guy who owned the liquor store, but his son who's a very rich guy to this day, was developing a little magazine business. But he was one of the few guys back in 1959 that knew that kids would pay more for old comics than less. So he had his quarter box, his 50-cent box, his dollar box. And the irony of this whole thing is, one day he needed help in the back, and he ended up giving me a job, 9 years old, sorting comic books in the back room. So it's kind of ironic. My first job I ever had was dealing with comic books, and to this day, that's what I do for a living. But the thing that's neat about this is you look around this whole room and watch this industry grow up as you and I have watched it grow up. We watched it go from the guys behind the table with the T-shirts and whatever to this beautiful display of professional booths, is that all over the country, all over the world, collectors had one commonality. They had this inherent love for the product. And every one of us thought we were the only collector in the world. And that's why when comic stores started to come about, we created a place where they could let their hair down. The guy, the brown bag buyer who used to sneak into the 7-Eleven, get his comics and go out the door because he didn't want his friends or family to know he was a grown man buying comics, now goes into a comic store and he talks to the customers and hey, what'd you think of the latest issue of Spider-Man? And he feels normal about it because most of his friends, when he goes home, he says, gee, I collect comics. They look at him like he has two heads. And the analogy I always use is, if you had two guys sitting on a bus and one's in a three-piece suit and he's reading a science fiction paperback, nobody thinks anything wrong with that. The format is acceptable. It's a paperback. It might be, science fiction. The other guy sitting there with a comic book, and it's got that format. It looks like maybe you're illiterate or juvenile delinquent. Now, both of these guys are reading about little green men.